Welcome back to our investigation. We've discovered that our suspect is relatively new to the scene, and that she's a chameleon. So how do we identify her? Well, keep sticking with me, kid, because we're about to blow her cover wide open. Let's begin by going back to the definition we first posed at the beginning of our investigation. A reply card is the card that's included in a wedding invitation suite for the purpose of responding to the wedding invitation. As a designer, the way to look at it is, this is the card used to get from the guests all the information the wedding hosts need from them. So the reply is an extremely important card, but because of its size, its wording and layout needs to be as succinct and clutter-free as possible. So in order to investigate the wording on the card, we're going to proceed as I would with a bride while consulting with her. And to do that, I would start from the top line and go line by line to the bottom of the card. Beginning at the top of our suspect, the first thing we come upon is the request line. Now, not all cards will have to follow the same format. The request line may sometimes be found on the bottom of the card. But, just as in an invitation, you must have an invite line, on a reply card, you must have a request line. Though there are no cut and dry rules of laying out a reply card, a good rule of thumb to follow is that the formality of the request line should match the formality of the invitation. If you have a far more casually, comfortably worded invitation, you'll not want to now compose a very formally worded reply card. The level of formality should be consistent. Your request line may take many different formats, ranging from the very formal, "the favor of your reply is requested," to the least formal, which might simply be the letters RSVP. And for those not familiar with what RSVP stands for, it's the initialism of the French phrase "Répondez s'il vous plaît," which literally translated is "respond if you please," or simply translated, "please respond." Though "Répondez s'il vous plaît" is no longer used much in France, as it's considered a bit old-fashioned, here in the United States, the initialism RSVP has found its way to being used as not only a verb, as in, I need to RSVP for the meeting, but also a noun. They have my RSVP, I mailed it last week. A lone RSVP may be considered informal on the request line, but just as informal would be simply the word reply or respond. Adding formality to the way of writing the line would be to simply add a please, as in please RSVP or please reply. But that being said, there may be certain design layouts where the design is more aesthetically pleasing when using the single word or letters as a design element, and adding additional words might not work with the design. As for requesting the reply, there are very many phrases that you might choose. Kindly respond, kindly reply, the favor of your reply. However it's worded, the rule of thumb to keep in mind, again, is that your phrase matches the tone of the wedding invitation formality. Remember, you're simply requesting a response. You want to know if they're coming or not coming, and you're asking them to let you know. And even that could be another way of phrasing the request line. Please let us know. There are no hard and fast rules here. And in relation to our request line, I also give my brides the option of adding the wording on or before to their reply by date, or simply by their reply by date. And this is completely up to them. Now, trickier than it would seem is the selection for the date of the response's return. And in my consulting experience, this is the time where the majority of my brides will turn to me and go, "What's the date I'm supposed to use?" As if in their understanding there is a traditional or uniform time frame for all invitation replies to be returned. But remember, for the vast majority of brides, they will never have done this before. So there's no way for them to have this information. And so my answer always goes something like this. On your venue's contract, what is the date that you're required to have your final count into them? Because this is the purpose of the reply card, or the reason for having a reply card. The host of the reception will need to give a final count to the venue because that is the number that the venue is going to hold them to plan for, and to bill them for in regards to food, drinks, etc. And once that number is returned, the host is required by contract to honor and pay for that number of guests, even if at the time of the event, the number turns out to be much smaller than the number committed to. So in essence, the information the host receives from the reply card is information they need to turn around and give it right back to the venue. And the vast majority of time, this reply by date is simply a date that corresponds with the venue's contract date for when the final count is due. This final count date will always be different according to different venues. Some venues will require a final count 3 weeks out. Some might require a count 5 days out. This date is a constant unknown. And many times it's a date the bride will have to give me after the consultation, because they'll have to check their contract. And when this happens, we simply use a dummy date and change it once the final date is decided upon. Let's say my bride has given me the date of, we'll say April 15th, that her venue is asking for her final count on. What I will tell her is that we'll want to set our reply by date at least 1 week earlier than our final count date. So you'll have enough time for stragglers come in and be able to have a solid number to turn around and give your venue on April 15th. Given that, we'll still look at the calendar and see what day that falls on. And for instance, if it falls on a weekend or even a holiday or near a holiday, we might add even more days and choose an even earlier day for the reply by date. And there are going to be certain cases when the venue doesn't need a count, and so it doesn't need this information. When that's the case, there might not be a need for a reply card. Though I have had certain situations where the venue is not asking for a number from the host, but the host of the wedding still wants to know who is coming to the reception. Under these circumstances, the reply by date will be simply a date that the host will select. So then, now we have our request line, whether formal or informal, friendly or warm, and we also have the date by which we'd like our reply to be returned. We also know if the bride would like to have them reply by or reply on or before. The next thing I'll ask my bride is if they'd like to write out the date formally or if they'd like to write it out numerically. Now, very many times, as with all things wedding, the bride is looking to you for guidance. If they don't have a definite idea of what they want, they'll ask your recommendation. In this case, what I generally explain is, unfortunately, in our modern culture, we are really lazy readers. Also, we're so pressed for time that we like things cut and dry, very easy to see, and very easy to comprehend. It is much easier for one to simply glance at a date that's written numerically as in April 5, 2025, and have that register in our brain, as opposed to looking at a sentence and disciplining our eyes to stop and read what a sentence says, as in on or before the 5th of April. Our brains register the numerical date more quickly and retain that much more readily than when we see it formally written out. And we want our guests to register that they need to get this back to us by that certain date. So we want to facilitate it as best as possible. Another recommendation, over and above writing the date in a numerical format, is also laying out the date in a block text, because this also will assist the guests in registering the date mentally and placing a number in their mind more easily, so that they'll then remember to respond when the time comes. But still again, This is a matter of preference for the bride. We now have our request line, our reply by date, and whether the bride wishes to spell the date out or write it numerically. In our next section, we begin requesting information from our guest. Our first fill-in section is simply a request for their name. Traditionally, these lines were laid out in this manner: M blank, where M signifies the beginning of their title, as in Mr. and Mrs., or as in Miss, etc. And the guest writes out the rest of their title after the M. However, in my consulting experience, a question I would hear more often than not is, what does the M stand for? Or they might outright tell me, I don't know what the M means. This is completely understandable, as our modern culture has become so casual and informal that we very rarely use titles when speaking with others or addressing them. When this is the case, as we've learned in our section on etiquette, etiquette is making others feel comfortable in our world. It would easily follow that the bride's guests would also have those same questions. What does the M stand for? Or what am I supposed to do with this line? So immediately upon hearing this question or statement, I explain what the M is for, and then simply offer, we can use name here instead of M if you'd like. And generally the response is going to be, yes, let's just use name there. Now, if the question doesn't come up by the time we're on this line in our consultation, what I then do is ask my bride, would you like to use the M or name? And whatever she says, that's what we do. Now, if we're already going in a more formal direction, I'll rephrase my question and ask, shall we put M here? And there's a possibility that she then says, I don't know what that means. If this is the case, what I do is simply explain what the M means and also let her know that M is the more formal format to follow. But then I write down her preference because it is her invitation. Okay, so now we have our respond request, we have our reply date, we have our names written, and now we need their response. Yes? No? If it were that easy. As with the other lines, these responses are a little more challenging than they seem. Do the hosts simply need a yes or no answer, or do they need a little bit more information than that? And if simply a yes or no, how would they like to phrase the answer for that yes and the answer for that no? And you will find that many of your brides will be very involved in their reply card and definitely have a say as to how they want their yes and their no worded. Some might not even accept a no, but want to know that their guests will be there in spirit as well. In my experience, the simple yes and no and then we're done card is pretty rare. Often, along with the yes or no answers, the bride will also request a number of her guests. And this happens especially when there's numbers of families that are invited. Also, there may be certain circumstances when the host of the wedding will want to limit the number of guests per invitation. And this is a sensitive topic where at times you might hear that it's rather improper to inform the guests that their number of invitees is limited. My take on this, and with other circumstances regarding a bride's wording on her invitation or her additional pieces of her wedding suite, is that every bride comes with her own unique set of circumstances, and each bride knows her guest list and who it is she is inviting. It has happened pretty often that my brides will say, oh, I know my family. And if they get an invitation to a wedding, they think they can invite 12 of their neighbors for a free meal. So needless to say, she'll want to limit up front the guests that are invited per invitation. So in the world that this bride lives in, it is a very reasonable thing for her to specify the number of invitees per invitation. She's inviting Cousin Jane and her husband and her one child, and not 12 extra people from the neighborhood. In these specific cases where the bride knows she has a problem guest list, what I recommend is that we add a line beneath the name line that states, "We have reserved blank seats in your honor." And when they're assembling the invitation, they fill in the number of invitees per that invitation's address. For instance, in the case just mentioned, she would fill out the number 3 for her cousin Jane, her husband, and her one child. Each bride's circumstances will be unique, and that is why it's so important to be present and listen to your bride. I make it my responsibility as a wedding invitation consultant to learn about each bride when they come in. And much of my time consulting is simply listening to the bride, learning about her relationship with her fiancé, her parents, her soon-to-be in-laws, and all the different elements that she's juggling in the air and are coming together to create this wonderful event for this wonderful bride. And by this time in the consultation, I'll generally have a really good feel for her whole wedding and be able to guide her in the best direction concerning specific sticky issues like adding this line. Because again, there will be certain circumstances when specifying a number of seats reserved would be considered impolite. And for those situations when the bride would like to curtail the number of guests per invitation, but doesn't have the familiarity with her guest list in order to do so, what I recommend is that she add an additional line to the card requesting the number attending. In this case, should a guest send a number over and above what was expected, what I explain is the proper thing to do would be to contact the guest in order to clarify the number invited. And this is a great place to plug inner envelopes. On your inner envelope, you would have specified who specifically is invited to the wedding. And should you have a situation where the bride or the hosts of the reception are reluctant to have to communicate this to their guests, well, there's always an Aunt Esther who will be very, very happy to call people and let them know that they are out of their mind if they think they're going to bring 12 extra people to a $150, let's say, plate dinner. We have our request line, the reply date, our guest names, our yes/no wording, and have dealt with the option of requesting a number attending. But many times the information needed from guests goes far beyond the simple, "Are you coming or not?" Additional information often requested is for plated dinners with options for entrees. In this situation, the host will need an answer for the preference of meal. And as with other items, there is no one right way to list meals. Your rule of thumb, however, is to lay out the card in such a way that it's very clear what's being asked and what's being answered. And again, this is a bit more challenging than it seems. The key to laying out a reply card is being able to guide your guest to answer and give you the information that is needed in as few words as possible. We're now adding a second section requesting additional information, and so we begin by adding a new request line. This begins with a clearly worded and succinct request for this additional information, and continues by laying out the various answers in such a way that answer A is very distinct from answer B, which is sitting right next to it, and so on. Many times, these selections will thankfully be quite simple to lay out, but at times the host of the wedding will want to add a little more describing the delicious meals that they've selected for their guests. Your duty as a designer is to ensure that your layout isn't cluttered and that your requests are intelligible and easy to follow. And remember, not only will you need to list their selections, but you will also need to allow numbering for each selection they are choosing. And now, even though this seems completely unrelated, I'd like to take some time here to comment on registries and wedding website addresses. In my class, Design Wedding Invitations That Sell, I covered registry information and explained that nowhere in your wedding invitation suite do you want to have any wording referring to a bride's registry. It is considered poor form to request a gift from your guests, and any form of wording stating registry is requesting a gift, because that is what a registry is. A bride has registered for gifts here. So nowhere do we want the word registry to appear in a wedding invitation suite. Given that, I also mentioned in the class, and if you haven't taken that class yet, I invite you to do so. There's so much information that I cover regarding wedding invitations, and in the future I'll be going into even more detail on many of those topics covered. But now, given that we don't want the word registry to appear anywhere in the wedding invitation suite, there are some workarounds that we can do to lead the guests to the registry information without having to use that word. My number one recommendation for this is adding wording somewhere in the invitation suite inviting the guests to visit the wedding website, where upon visiting the site, the registry information or tab is readily accessible to the guests. Having wedding website information is a more gracious and courteous option for making registry information available to guests. And given that there's so much more information that can be made available for them there, such as directions, accommodations, etc., a wedding website can be a great courtesy for the guests. But where to put this website address? I recommend that a bride look at her wedding invitation as a historical document, so that 10 years from now, when she looks at her invitation, or her descendants look at her invitation, she's not going to want to see front and center a wedding website that no longer exists. And who knows, we may not even have websites by that time. So I don't recommend putting her website information on the invitation itself, but on one of the additional cards, or on a card of its own. And the reason I bring this up now is that when the question arises as to where this information should go, many times the bride will suggest the reply card. My answer to that is to remember that the guests will be returning the reply card to the hosts of the wedding, so they will no longer have the wedding website address in hand once they do so. But in the end, if there is absolutely no other way to add an additional card into the budget, then the reply card would have to be the place that this information would appear. And so now, with all our information carefully laid out, you would think we were finished. But there is one more step.